respected organizers of this webinar, and all the delegate friends. First of all, thank you, Ratan Samalji, for your kind words. Again, without wasting much of time, as Ratanji has already pointed out, that this particular topic is of immense importance in any indirect tax law, and particularly in GST, because we have multiple slab rates. The difference between the slab rates is also huge. So you could go from 0 to 28%. So any error can lead to huge demands on our clients. So we need to be absolutely sure while determining the rate of tax for any commodity or service. Now, I have divided the session into 14 different heads, as is visible in the Word file. We'll first try to understand the scheme of the Constitution as well as the statutory provisions governing classification, and then we'll gradually move to certain intricate issues involved in the classification. First is how this classification comes into the picture from the point of view of the Constitution. We all know that Article 246A gives power to the Parliament as well as to the state legislatures to make laws with respect to GST. Secondly, the GST Council is constituted under Article 279 capital A, where one of the functions of the GST Council is to determine rates, including floor rates. Keeping these two bases in mind, the Parliament as well as the state legislatures have enacted Section 9, subsection 1, which is the charging section for GST, and which says that there shall be levied a tax on supply of goods or services at rates not exceeding 20%, as may be notified by the government on recommendations of the council. So the section gives the upper limit for fixing of rates, but delegates the actual fixation of rates to the state government or the delegated legislation based on the recommendation of the council. The first moot question is whether such delegation is permissible or not, whether the state legislature or the Parliament can leave it to the government to determine the rate of tax by virtue of notifications. One of the arguments that we have commonly taken while challenging any delegated legislation before a court is that the section suffers from excessive delegation. An essential function cannot be abdicated by a legislature. An essential function has to be determined by the legislature, and therefore, if a provision gives too much of leeway to the government or to the delegated legislation, that is excessive delegation. The first moot point is that whether such an argument is ever tenable against Section 9(1). Can we say that no, the rate of tax should have been stipulated under the Act itself? They could not have delegated to the government. For such purpose, we'll refer to a judgment in the case of Gwalior Rayon Manufacturing Company Limited, 33 STC 219 Supreme Court. This was a case where the validity of Section 8, subsection 2, clause B of the Central Sales Tax Act had been challenged on the ground that when it borrowed the state rates for the purpose of interstate sales, that was excessive delegation. The Parliament had abdicated its function of determining the rate of tax. Supreme Court noted that it was not a simpliciter case of delegation. The linkage of the interstate sale tax rate with the local sales tax rate was part of the legislative policy of the Parliament, and therefore, because it was guided by legislative policy, it could not have been said that there was excessive delegation and that it was abdication of power by the legislature. So the validity of 8(2)(b) was upheld by the Supreme Court. According to me, this would straight away apply to Section 9, subsection 1. Although government has the right to fix the rate of tax by virtue of a notification, the section itself says that this will be on recommendations of the council. So a legislative policy is framed, that too in consonance with Article 279 capital A, which gives the GST Council the power to fix the rate of tax. And the legislature says that as the GST Council determines, the government by notification should stipulate the rate of tax. So even though government by notification stipulates the rate of tax, we cannot say it is excessive delegation or prone to any dispute in that sense. Second and more important, according to me, the question is, the punchline for GST has been that one nation, one tax, uniform tax rates across the country. That was the very fundamental basis for introduction of GST. Till now, the parliament and the state legislatures have adhered to this fundamental. The CGST and SGST rate for all goods and for all services are uniform. There is no problem. Question is whether in law there is any mandate for the states to abide by the rates which are recommended by the council and to keep the SGST rate equal to the CGST rate. If you look at the present section 9.1 of CGST or 9.1 of any SGST, it says that government will stipulate rates as recommended by the council. So the section as it stands, there is no leeway for the state government to notify a different rate. But suppose, say in the present situation of COVID, if a state is facing immense financial crunch, and so it decides that for some commodities, it wants to impose higher SGST. Question is whether that is permissible or not. Ex facie, it would seem that there is no constitutional bar because the GST Council is only a recommendatory body. The parliament as well as the state legislatures are given the power to impose GST, and therefore the state may argue that where can you find that we cannot impose a rate of SGST which is higher than CGST, particularly when we are able to justify the cost for such higher levy. We have an abnormal situation right now, so we want to raise more revenue, so we are increasing the rate of SGST. Question is whether this is permissible or not by introducing a new provision is the SGST Act. As I said, as section 9.1 as it stands in the different SGST Acts, right now it is not permissible. Question is whether the state legislature can amend the SGST Act itself and impose higher levies on certain commodities or maybe all commodities. So as I said, literal interpretation of the constitution, there does not seem to be a bar, but two judgments we need to discuss for a counter proposition. First, Kerala High Court in the case of OPaC Engineering Private Limited, and second, Gujarat High Court recent judgment in the case of Reliance Industries Limited versus State of Gujarat. Both these judgments, the issue was whether after the Constitution Amendment Act, the VAT Act, which was repealed or which was substantially reduced to only 6 commodities, would be retrospectively amended or not. In both the cases, the argument was that after the constitutional amendment, the states lost the power to amend the VAT Acts. Kerala High Court takes a view that, so before we go to the Kerala High Court view, the stand of the department before both the courts was that although entry 54 may be deleted except for the 6 commodities, ultimately we have the power to impose goods and service tax. Sales tax or VAT is also nothing but a tax on goods, supply of goods, sale of goods, and therefore we retain the power to make amendments even in the VAT Act. Kerala High Court takes a view that if you look at the scheme of the GST, the state does not have the power to unilaterally impose the GST. The power has to be exercised simultaneously by the parliament and the state and not by the state unilaterally. And therefore, if you look at the scheme of and the purpose of the entire Constitutional Amendment Act, we cannot accept the stand of the government that even after the constitution is amended, by virtue of Article 246 capital relating to GST, the VAT Act can be amended. Similar view is canvassed by the Gujarat High Court. Again, in the context of an amendment in the VAT Act, the Gujarat High Court also takes a view that we cannot hold that such an amendment in the VAT Act is supported by Article 246 capital A. But the question would be that whether these judgments will help in a case where the amendment is to the GST law itself, because the judgments were in the context of the earlier laws which were repealed, and the courts took a view that we'll say that no, after GST there cannot be unilateral exercise of power by the states for amending the VAT Act. According to me, these judgments will definitely help in such contention, in raising such contention, that ultimately the power has to be simultaneous, not unilateral. Otherwise, the entire scheme and mechanism will fail. But we'll have to wait and watch. First of all, we'll see whether any state is adopting such a drastic move. If it does so, then the legality of such move will have to be tested in the court. This was about the constitutional framework. Next, we move to the scheme of classification. Now, whenever we intend to classify any transaction under the GST law, first and foremost, we need to determine whether it is a transaction of goods or whether it is a transaction of services. There are separate, absolutely separate schedules for goods and services. So the first step before going any further is to make such determination. The definition of goods is contained in section 2 subsection 52. Definition of goods in a way is similar to the definition of goods which was contained in the VAT Acts, the earlier VAT Acts. It says every kind of movable property other than money and securities, but includes actionable claim, growing crops, grass, etc. And services is defined under section 202, subsection 102, to mean anything other than goods, money and securities. So first we need to see whether it is goods or not. If they are not goods, then they would be services. We need to keep in mind two judgments of the Supreme Court in the context of goods. One, Tata Consultancy Services versus State of Andhra Pradesh 137 STC 620, where it was held that properties which are capable of being abstracted, consumed and used or transmitted, transferred, delivered, stored or possessed as goods would be goods. It was also held that intangible goods are also goods. Second judgment, Yasha Overseas 17 VST 182, where it was held that while lottery ticket is an actionable claim, REP licenses have an innate value of their own and a market of their own, and therefore they are goods. So we need to adopt and apply those judgments even in the context of GST, and first of all determine whether a transaction is that of goods or services. Once that is determined, only then we can move forward and decide what is the rate of tax. In this determination of whether the transaction is of goods or services, we also need to keep in mind Schedule 2. Because while goods and services are defined under the statute, Schedule 2 is also forming part of the statute, where certain transactions are defined to be treated as goods or transaction of services. So although by definition a transaction may be of goods, Schedule 2 may say that no, this particular transaction is to be treated as a transaction of services. And Schedule 2 being a specific provision that would prevail over the general definition clause. One example can be transfer of right to use goods. Transfer of right to use goods, even under the VAT laws, we understood to be a deemed sale transaction. It also involves in a way supply of goods only, although for maybe a limited period. Even then, Schedule 2 will say that transfer of right to use goods should be treated as a transaction of services. So the definition of goods, definition of services, judgments in the context of goods under the earlier laws, and Schedule 2. These are the three elements which need to be kept in mind while determining whether a transaction is that of goods or that of services. Now we move to classification of goods. The classification schedule of goods is based on HSN. Now this is a divergence from VAT laws of most of the states, at least insofar as Gujarat is concerned. Gujarat VAT schedules were not based on HSN. So for practitioners on VAT and sales tax, there will be a sea change in the method of classification, because the principles which we earlier used to follow and the earlier judgments, they may lose its significance. We will, as we go further, we will analyze how there will be a change in the method of classification. First of all, let us understand what is HSN. HSN is the harmonized system of nomenclature developed by the World Customs Organization. So it is a global coding system. It has two objects primarily. One is uniformity in classification. Second, also for international trade statistics. Because if we want to know that globally what item is traded in what quantity, etc., then if that would be possible only if they are classified in a uniform manner. Otherwise, those statistics will also not be possible. There are more than 5,000 products which are listed in the HSN schedule. Very importantly, we should note that the HSN system is a system which is defining the goods by description and not by their use, etc. In our VAT schedules, we were very used to certain entries. For example, say LPG. But LPG for domestic use was a declared commodity, declared goods commodity. So there would be various entries where the classification was based not only on discrimination, not only on description of the goods, but also on further use of the goods. Per se, in HSN, that is not the case. When HSN is adopted for GST schedules, there may be certain entries where such kind of deviation is made. But per se, when we are understanding HSN, we should understand that it is based on description and not on use. So you will find an entry for LPG in the HSN, but in the HSN, there will be no entry which says that domestic LPG or industrial LPG or anything of that sort. Secondly, HSN is of 6 digits. It is in the customs that it has been extended to 8 digits, and which is also followed for GST. Otherwise, HSN per se is 6 digits. It is well settled that if a schedule is based on HSN, then HSN has to be followed. So then there is no question of adopting any other mechanism for interpreting that entry other than HSN. Lead judgment in the case of Collector of Central Excise versus Woodcraft Products Limited, 1995, 77 ELT 23, Supreme Court. Here, the question was of classification of a blackboard. The entry was similar. The entry in question was similar laminated wood. A contra entry was suggested based on the ISI glossary. Supreme Court takes a view that excise tariff is based on the HSN. So unless there is a contrary intention in the excise tariff itself that for a particular commodity HSN is not to be followed, commonly the classification has to be based on HSN and not on anything else. So it is well settled that if the classification schedule is based on HSN, then the interpretation and the classification process has to proceed on the basis of the principles of HSN only. So the next question which arises is, if the classification schedule is based on HSN, then what is the relevance now of common parlance test in classification? As practitioners in sales tax and VAT, this common parlance test was very common to us. Any entry, the first test to be adopted, we were taught, was common parlance. How that goods are understood by a common man or by a trader, you interpret an entry according to that parlance. Two judgments. One, the lead judgment Ramavatar Budhay Prasad 12 STC 286 Supreme Court. Supreme Court takes a view that betel leaves, even though they are technically vegetables, in common parlance, the betel leaves are not understood to be vegetables and therefore they cannot be classified under the entry of vegetables. Per contra, Mangalu Sahu Ramahari Sahu 32 STC 494 Supreme Court, lemon which is technically a fruit, but which is commonly understood as vegetable, Supreme Court says that it is classified as a vegetable. These judgments, insofar as their general applicability is concerned, will lose significance under GST. If under the HSN, the betel leaves form part of the schedule for vegetables, then no matter in common parlance they are not vegetables, still because under HSN they are under vegetables, they will be classified as vegetables. So these judgments, as I said, insofar as their general applicability is concerned, will lose their significance. In fact, again, there is authority for this proposition, MP Agencies versus State of Kerala, 2015 79 VST 337, the Supreme Court categorically observes that in case where the coding is based on HSN, the common parlance test cannot be applied. So if the goods are accompanied by an HSN code, then you cannot adopt the common parlance test. I'll give an example of how this will change the situation. Suppose in Gujarat, at least, it is very common for sesame seeds, til, to be sold as a mouth freshener where it is seasoned with salt. So the til or sesame seeds are roasted, then salt, a bit of salt is added, and then they are sold. They are sold as til, they are sold as sesame seeds. Now suppose under the sales tax law, there was an entry for sesame seeds. We would very well say that, look, what is added is only a bit of salt. We sell this commodity as sesame seeds only. They are understood as sesame seeds only. And therefore, by applying the common parlance test, they are classifiable under the entry of sesame seeds. That would be how we would interpret an entry under the VAT or the sales tax schedule. However, if we look at the GST, sesame seeds are oil seeds. The relevant heading for the sesame seeds is 1207. Now, if we look at the chapter note, we will come again to those chapter notes and heading notes, etc., and their relevance. But for the timing, if we look at the chapter note of chapter 12, there is an observation to the effect that the seeds may have undergone heat treatment to ensure better preservation. However, such treatment will be permissible only if it does not alter the character of as natural products, and it does not make them suitable for specific use rather than general use. So oil seeds will continue as oil seeds. Firstly, the treatment may be heat treatment for preservation. Secondly, it should not be that they are made for some specific use and not for general use. So now if we look at this sesame seeds, which is seasoned with salt under HSN, because of such a chapter note, the correct classification cannot be under the heading 1207 for sesame seeds, because salt is added and it is made specific for use as mouth freshener only. It cannot be used for any other purpose as oil seeds. So this is only an example to show how this will be a classification which is in divergence with what we earlier understood. And so we cannot now, by merely looking at the heading, jump to the conclusion that this particular commodity is falling under this entry or not. So we as practitioners and advocates will also require a change in our mindset. Next question is, but does that mean that common parlance test is absolutely redundant insofar as GST is concerned? The answer is no. It will have its significance, particularly because our GST tariff as well as customs tariff is not completely as such in consonance with HSN. It is not as if word by word the HSN entries are transposed into the GST tariff or the customs tariff. There are changes made. Single headings are broken up into different schedules. So Some commodities of a particular schedule may be 5%, some commodities of a particular heading may be 18%, some commodities may be exempt also. In such context, common balance test will be relevant. Again, I will take an example which is a burning controversy right now in Gujarat in the context of papad. If we look at heading 1905, heading 1905 includes many commodities such as bread, pizza bread, papad, etc. This heading is broken up again in the schedules. Heading 1905, papad contained in the exempt schedule. Some commodities heading 1905, 5%. Other commodities heading 1905, 18%. So now question is, what is a papad? Now when we want to answer that question, there will be no guidance under the HSN. HSN will only give guidance as to what will fall under 1905. But in 1905 itself, what is a particular commodity and what is not, there would not be any guidance. Secondly, for colloquial terms like papad, which is not understood globally, there will be no guidance in HSN. In such circumstances, the common balance test will be extremely relevant. So there we again move to our original mode of classification. We decide whether the commodities in common balance known as papad or not, and accordingly classify. As I said, this is already a controversy. Tamil Nadu, in the case of Subramani Sumathi, an advanced ruling, holds that Meda Vadam, although of a different shape, is a papad. Gujarat, advanced ruling authority in the case of Sonal products, takes a view based on common balance that fryams, which are a sort of small papads, in common balance are not known as papad, and therefore the exemption is disallowed. So whatever may be the correct classification, we will not get into that because that will be very subjective. But whatever be the correct classification, the mode of determination of the classification will be the common balance test and not the HSN. So we need to be careful when to apply the common balance test and when to not. When there is specific guidance in HSN, we need to follow the HSN. When there is no such specific guidance, then we have to resort to common balance test. Another precaution which we need to take while we are classifying under the GST law and while we are interpreting HSN is not to be carried away by logic. There will be certain things or certain classifications which may seem illogical. Now, as I said, as I took my first example of sesame seeds, where salt is added, I refer to that chapter note of 1207, where it is said that if it is transformed from general use to specific use, it cannot be oil seeds. And therefore, I said that correct classification cannot be 1207. Now, let us take an example of coriander seeds or dhana dal as we commonly understand. So, again the same process, the dhana dal is roasted, salt is added, and it is sold as dhana dal. Logically, we might feel that if sesame seeds added with salt does not fall under the entry of oil seeds or not under the entry of sesame seeds, then coriander seeds added with salt will not fall under the entry of coriander seeds. But that will not be the case. While sesame seeds are oil seeds, coriander seeds are spices. Spices falling under chapter 9 of the HSN. Now, if we look at the chapter note of chapter 9, there is a specific reference to say that addition of other ingredients is not barred, even for a commodity to continue to be classified as a spice. Where examples are given of food colorings or products which are added to intensify a flavor or salt. So there is a specific reference, in fact, of salt, which is there in chapter 9, chapter note, and where it is said that addition of certain other commodities is not a bar, obviously, unless the essential character is lost. And therefore, even though coriander seeds added with salt can also have only one use, and that as a mouth freshener, still because of such a chapter note, dhana dal can be classified under the chapter heading 0909. In fact, this was a controversy earlier under the excise law. In a circular dated 15/4/1996, the Central Board of Excise and Customs expressly clarifies this based on this chapter note to say that dhana dal will continue under 0909. This is just to highlight that when we are looking at HSN, we follow the HSN, we do not let it be overweighed or overswayed by logic. We need to follow the HSN. If HSN does not give an answer, then we go a step further and apply the common parlance test or logic, etc. Now, next we move to the general rules of interpretation of customs tariff. The explanation to the rate notifications under the GST says that the general rules of interpretation as well as the section note, heading notes, etc. of the customs tariff will be applicable for interpretation of GST tariff. So we need to be well aware of the rules of interpretation and how they are applicable insofar as the GST tariff is concerned. First rule, rule 1, says that the titles to the sections and chapters are only for ease of reference, and the classification is to be made in terms of the headings and the notes thereto. So the section, the HSN is divided into 11 sections and thereby sections and thereafter chapters and thereafter headings. But the rule says we cannot go by the section or the chapter heading. We have to go by the specific heading name and the heading notes thereto and classify the goods. This is the primary rule. So ordinarily, any classification under GST has to be in terms of the heading, not otherwise. Only if there is some ambiguity in classifying in terms of the heading, then we move further and go to the other rules. But the primary rule is rule 1. If by rule 1 itself the classification is clear, we do not move forward. This is also again very important, because as we move further to the other rules, there may be we may be tempted in particular circumstances to straight away jump to a certain rule, which is not permissible. If primarily by virtue of the heading note itself it is classifiable under a particular heading, then we don't go to the further rules. Next we move to rule 2 subrule A, subclause A. It says that any reference in a heading to an article shall be taken to include a reference to that article, incomplete or unfinished, provided that as presented, the incomplete or unfinished article has the essential character of the complete or finished. Again, we take the example of papad. The entry is of papad. We generally consume the papad after roasting, but papad which is sold in an unroasted form, in an incomplete form, will also continue to be papad because it has the essential characteristic of a papad. So a particular heading will be deemed to include an incomplete or unfinished form of a particular product also, provided the essential character of the product is not lost. A judgment in the context of this rule in the case of Commissioner of Customs versus Sony India Limited 2008 13 SCC 145. This was a case where component parts of television were imported. The duty was paid by the company by treating them as component parts. The department relied on Rule 2 capital A to say that these are nothing but incomplete television sets, and therefore the duty applicable to television sets should have been paid. Supreme Court takes a view that the parts which are imported are independently sellable. There is nothing to show that this was only a television in a knockdown form. These were parts. The parts were used in the manufacture of television, and therefore Rule 2 Clause A is not applicable. Again, just to show that there can be varied uses of this rule for and against us. So we may classify it based on our understanding on what it is, but we should keep in mind that the department may take a view that it is only an unfinished form of something else, and therefore it goes into another entry. Next, we move to Rule 2 Clause B. Rule 2 Clause B says that any reference in a heading to a material or substance shall be taken to include reference to mixtures or combination of that material or substance with other materials. Pausing here for a moment, we take an example of hardware loaded with software. So, entry for hardware would also be taken to include a commodity which is a mixture or combination with another commodity. Similarly, an entry for software would also be taken to be including a commodity which is software with another commodity, that is hardware. There is another leg of the rule also, but first of all, we determine how do we settle this issue of classification. So there is hardware like a CD and software which is loaded on the CD, and that CD is sold. How do we classify this? For products which are falling under Rule 2 Clause B, we go to Rule 3. Rule 3 says that whereby application of Rule 2 Clause B or otherwise, if the goods are classifiable under two or more headings, then A, the heading which provides for the most specific description shall be preferred to heading providing general description. However, if each heading refers to only a part of the commodity, each heading to be treated as equally specific. Now, if in this example of hardware loaded with software, each heading, there is a heading for hardware, there is a heading for software. Each heading will be referring to only part of the commodity, and therefore both the headings are to be treated as equally specific. And therefore Rule 3 Clause A does not solve our classification problem. If it does not solve, then we go to Rule 3 Clause B, which says that if it cannot be classified by Rule 3A, then the classification has to be as if they consisted material which give them their essential character. So first we see if it is specific versus general. If there is no solution based on this rule, then we look at what material gives them their essential character. Now in the case of this very same example, there is a judgment of the Supreme Court in the context of again customs, Sprint RPG India Limited versus Commissioner of Customs, 2002 SCC 486. Here the software was valued at rupees 67 lakhs, hardware was valued at rupees 60,000, and hardware loaded with software was imported. Supreme Court, based by giving credence to this value, took a view that what was imported was essentially a software. The essential character was given to the material by the software, and therefore by applying Rule 3 Clause B, the commodity would be classifiable under the entry of software. Second example, second judgment in this context in the case of Collector of Central Excise versus Bakelite Hylam Limited, 1997, 10 SCC 350. This was a question of classification of decorative laminated sheet, which was made out of paper and resin. Supreme Court takes a view that the laminated sheet gets its essential character from the rigidity of that sheet as well as its resistance to heat and moisture. So it is the resins which give the commodity its essential character and not the paper, and therefore they have to be classified accordingly by applying rule 3 clause B. So what gives the commodity an essential character would be determined on the basis of variety of factors which can include value or physical characteristics, and it would be subjective. But keeping in mind these judgments and such factors, we can determine what is the correct classification. So this was an example of rule 2 clause B read with rule 3 clause B. Next, we take an example of what can be something which can be solved by rule 3 clause A, because rule 3 says that whereby application of rule 2B or otherwise, if goods are classifiable under 2 or more headings, then the rule 3 is to be followed. We take an example of a product which is famous in Surat, which is called Surti Farmasu. It is a sort of a toasted bread. It is similar to a toasted bread. Now, heading 1905 again is split up into more than two schedules, as I had indicated earlier. Bread is exempt. Rusk, toasted bread and similar toasted products are taxable at 5%. Now, one can say that this Farmasu is bread, but the entry for toasted bread is a more specific entry. And therefore, by applying rule 3 clause A, the heading which provides the most specific description shall be referred to headings providing general description, and therefore the entry for toasted bread is to be preferred over the entry for bread simpliciter. So all these rules have their applicability in different sets of circumstances, and we need to be sure that we are well versed with the contents of all the rules. Not forgetting, as I said earlier, that the first and foremost rule is that it has to be in terms of the head. Classification has to be in terms of the heading. I will again go back to my example of sesame seeds and how we can falter if we straight away go to a particular rule. Rule 2B, which I just referred to, said that any reference in a heading to a material or substance shall be taken to include reference to mixture or combination of that material substance with another material. So now sesame seeds added with salt, we can falter and go straight to rule 2A, rule 2B and say that look, it is nothing but mixture of sesame seeds and salt. So we go to rule 3. Rule 3A is not applicable. We go to rule 3B. 3B says that whatever gives it the essential character, we have to classify accordingly. And therefore, we take a view that the essential character is given by sesame seeds, and therefore we classify under sesame seeds. That would not be the correct method of classification, because rule 1 says that first you go by the terms of the heading. If by the terms of the heading itself, it gets ousted from the entry of sesame seeds, then we cannot put it back into that entry by virtue of applying the rules. So that is a fundamental thing which needs to be kept in mind. And last in rule 3 is clause C, which says that if the classification is not possible by clause A or clause B, then whatever occurs last in the numerical order, that has to be adopted. So that is simply mathematical. If everything fails, then in the entries, whatever appears last, that is the entry which is to be adopted. Rule 4 says that if nothing is possible, if the goods are not classifiable in any manner by the earlier rules, then they have to be classified according to the goods to which they are most akin, which we understand as similar goods. But that would ordinarily not be applicable unless it is a new product. If it is an altogether new commodity where we are not able to classify it under any heading, then probably rule 4 would come into the picture and it would be classified on the basis of a similar product. So this was about the general rules of interpretation. Next, we take the principle which is well established under the sales tax and VAT laws regarding residuary entries. we quote the judgment of Supreme Court Mori East India Private Limited versus State of UP 14 VST 259 Supreme Court, day in and day out, where we say that residuary entry is to be preferred as the last resort. Generally, the classification should be made in the specific entry. This is nothing as such but an offshoot of that rule 3A, which says that specific to be the specific entry should be preferred over the general. But residuary entry may not be strictly general entry. So this principle will also be applicable. So if it is 2 entries, then specific over general entry. But if it is specific over residuary entry, then apart from the rule, the principle of residuary entry to be resorted as last resort, that is also applicable even in HSN. That is in fact held in one of the decisions of Supreme Court, Western India Plywoods Limited versus Collector of Customs, 2005-12 SCC 731. What we need to understand while applying this principle is that unlike the VAT laws, where there was only one residuary entry, under the HSN and the GST tariff, each HSN, each heading will have a residuary entry. So this principle will apply not only to the general residuary entry, but also to the residuary entry of each heading, because each heading will specify certain commodities and the last would be other. So that other is the residuary entry of that particular heading, and the principle of residuary entry to be resorted as last resort is to be applied there also. The next topic which we take up is the definition of registered brand name in the rate notification and its validity. In many of the commodities which are specified in the goods schedule, there is a different or a higher rate for goods which are sold under a registered brand name or under a brand name, unless we give an affidavit to the effect that we are not going to retain the intellectual property right on the commodity. We don't go to that second part. We concentrate on this registered brand name. What was noticed by the government was that looking to this difference in rate of tax after the introduction of the GST regime, many suppliers started deregistering their brand names to get the advantage of the lower rate of tax. The government, by notification dated 22nd September 2017, defined and amended the definition of registered brand name, wherein it was stated that registered brand name would mean a brand name which is registered as on 15th of May 2017, whether or not the brand is subsequently deregistered. So the government put a cutoff date. It said that as on 15th of May 2017, whatever brands are registered, we will consider them to be registered brands for eternity, even though you subsequently deregister them. Question is whether this is a valid classification. According to me, if suppose today, particularly in these COVID times, a person wants to get his brand deregistered because he feels that the benefits accruing out of the IPR law are far less than the benefits that would accrue out of reduction in tax rate. And therefore, if he wishes to deregister his brand name to get the benefit of lower rate of tax, question is that whether he can be precluded from doing so. Whether this artificial fiction and artificial date can be continued till eternity, whether such classification between brands which are deregistered now and which were deregistered earlier or which are never registered, whether that is permissible or not, according to me, this is prone to challenge. It is possible to say that such definition is violating Article 14 of the Constitution, impermissible classification. If I now want to deregister my brand and I also give an affidavit that I will not be pursuing my IPR on this particular brand forever, in such circumstances, I cannot be denied the benefit of the reduced rate of tax. Next, we come to exemptions. The GST rate schedules, apart from specifying the rates, there is also a separate notification for exemption under section 11 of the GST Act. Now here I would want to discuss a recent judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Commissioner of Customs versus Dilip Kumar and Company, 2018 9 SCC 1. This principle of interpretation of exemption notification is as such not a new principle, but there were certain conflicting judgments, and therefore the Constitution bench in this judgment settled the law. The Constitution bench takes a view that there is a difference between the method of interpreting a charging provision and an exemption notification. In charging provision, if two views are possible, the view in favor of the assessee is to be taken. In an exemption notification, if two views are possible, then the view in favor of the revenue is to be adopted. Secondly, the exemption notification is to be strictly construed, particularly at the threshold stage. Now here, according to me, although I may point out that this was also a judgment in the context of customs, which has also been following this HSN coding system. But what I would want to point out here is that in the context of schedules which are based on HSN, this judgment cannot be directly applied by the revenue. While an exemption notification, say under the VAT Act, would be directly hit by this judgment. So we need to strictly apply the wordings of the entries of the exemption notification before determining whether the goods fall in this entry or not. Insofar as the HSN schedules are concerned, because the exemption notification is also based on HSN, therefore we need to make the classification based on the HSN and the rules of interpretation. This judgment and the principle that exemption notification is to be strictly construed can be applicable only as a last resort if even by application of the HSN and the rules of interpretation, still there is some doubt and some two views are possible. Otherwise, according to me, a contention can be taken that if the rate schedule as well as the exemption notification is based on the HSN, then the classification also has to be based on the HSN. You cannot say that we will construe the exemption notification strictly and therefore in case of some doubt, we will straight away adopt the rate specified in the rate schedule. That judgment would not straight away apply insofar as the GST schedule is concerned, because it is based on HSN. Now, depending on the availability of time, I will go to my the other topics. I would just want to clarify when I should end, so I will accordingly move forward. Hello?
Can speak, Uchit bhai, you can speak.
Yeah, so, yeah, but I mean, when should I end? So I'll accordingly just manage my topic.
Management may speak about it.
Okay, I'll just continue. Just
Uchit,
let me know if
Uchit, please continue up to Uchit. Please continue up to 1:10.
Okay, fine.
So that I will have a 15 minutes time.
Okay. No, but I am told that there are question and answers also. Therefore, I was just wanted to clarify.
So up to 1 o'clock you can continue. Thereafter we will answer the question answer. Let me clarify the things, certain things. Thereafter
okay.
You can continue.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
Up to 1 o'clock you may continue.
Sure. So with this background of this judgment in mind, now let us move to the classification of services. While, as I explained earlier, the classification of goods is based on the HSN. Services, while these SAC codes are given, the service accounting codes are given, that is not some internationally accepted nomenclature, etc. the service descriptions, although there may be guidance taken from other laws, other jurisprudences, are basically like we had our schedules under VAT. They have to be interpreted as they are. So there are no, there would not be any such chapter notes, heading notes, etc., which are to be taken into consideration while we are classifying services. So we need to go by how the services are described and what are the words used, and accordingly we need to make our interpretation. So firstly there, what I would want to clarify is that this judgment of Dilip Kumar and company which I just cited, that would be directly relevant. So insofar as the charging section is concerned and the rate schedules of services are concerned, the principle of strict interpretation will apply. And if there are two views possible, the view in favor of the SSE would have to be adopted. Insofar as the exemption schedule of services is concerned, they have to be strictly construed, and in view of doubt, the exemption can be denied to the SSE. So because it is not based on HSN, we cannot straight away adopt any heading note to claim an exemption, even though the judgment says that the exemption notification is to be strictly applied. I may point out that interestingly, while I was going through the notifications, in the notification for services also, this explanation is there that the rules of interpretation under the customs tariff and the heading note and chapter note, etc., will be applicable. What I feel is that this is this would be just a case of copy and paste. Otherwise, strictly those rules of interpretation, etc., are meant for goods and not for services, and so the services notification need to be independently interpreted. Now, in the context of this notification for services, the first issue which I take up is certain entries where a concessional rate of 2.5% plus 2.5% is stipulated with a condition that provided the input tax credit has not been taken on the inputs or goods or services used in providing such services. Question is whether this is a mandatory rate or whether this is an optional rate. It seems that the view of the department is that it is a mandatory rate. So if in a particular transaction it is falling under a particular entry, then mandatorily you need to charge 2.5 plus 2.5% tax, and mandatorily you cannot take the input tax credit relating to such services. Here, according to me, the language of the entry does not support the case of the department. In majority of the entries, the language is provided input tax credit has not been taken. So the entry says that this is the rate provided ITC is not taken. So it is for me to decide whether I will be taking the input tax credit or not. If suppose I take the input tax credit, then the only consequence is that I will lose the benefit of the concessional rate. It cannot be the other way around. It cannot be that I decide not to take benefit of the concessional rate. I charge 18% tax, and still the department comes around and says that no, input tax rate is not admissible in your case, and therefore we will deny the input tax credit. You have already collected and paid 18%, and so we will not even grant you any adjustment or refund. Although this seems to be the view of the department, according to me that is not tenable. It is an option which is given, which is clear from the language itself. It cannot be said that if I claim the input tax credit, that will be disallowed. If I claim the input tax credit, I will only not be allowed to take the benefit of the concessional rate. Again, in all these headings for services, again there is a residuary entry, there's others. So if at all I do not take the benefit of that rate. And if I take the input tax credit, I will fall under that others part, and therefore I will be paying tax at the rate of 9% plus 9%. Next, I take up two exemptions for services, because insofar as goods are concerned, I have not gone into the specific classifications because that is not possible. We cannot, insofar as goods are concerned, discuss specific classifications of specific goods. But insofar as services are concerned, there are certain entries which are general in nature, and therefore I have picked up a couple of them just for the purpose of analyzing their scope. First entry is in the context of services which are provided to government, that is the state government, central government, or governmental authority, by way of any activity in relation to any function entrusted to a panchayat under or municipality under the Constitution of India, under two different articles of the Constitution of India. Now here the question which is arising is, what is the scope of this exemption entry? Ultimately, the purpose seems to be that the central government, state government, governmental authorities, by and large for these constitutional functions, are exempt from tax under the GST law. And therefore, to avoid their input tax becoming a burden onto them, this particular exemption is granted. So if a service is given to a government authority for such a function, in relation to such function entrusted under the Constitution, then the exemption is granted to the supplier. And therefore, the government authority will not have to bear the burden of that tax. Question is, what is meant by this phrase in relation to any function? We take an example of, say, a water supply board of the state government. The activity which is entrusted to the water supply board is health, sanitation, supply of drinking water, etc. All these activities are constitutional functions under the Constitution. Question is whether the benefit of the exemption is available only to the services which are directly related to the function of the board, or to all services which have a bearing or which are required for the board to give the undertake the constitutional function. For example, the water supply board is engaged in supplying through pipelines. The pipelines need repair. A contractor is hired for the purpose of the repair. The repair is directly related to the essential service, and therefore undoubtedly the exemption is available. But suppose the books of the water supply board are being audited by a statutory auditor, and the statutory auditor is charging fees. Question is whether GST is to be charged on such activity or not. According to me, no. The entry does not say that the exemption is restricted to the activities which are directly related to the function of the panchayat or municipality under the Constitution. It says that the exemption is available to services by way of any activity in relation to any function. So what needs to be established is only a correlation between the service and the input service and the output service. There need not be a distinction made between a service which is directly going for assisting the function or something which is indirectly assisting the function. There is no basis for such discrimination. There is an advance ruling of West Bengal in the case of ex-servicemen resettlement society. This was in the context of security services to government hospitals. The advance ruling authority takes a view that the GST exemption is only a continuation of the mega exemption given under the service tax law, and therefore under the service tax law, After an amendment made on 11th of July 2014, the exemption was only given to specific services directly connected with the function, and therefore for indirect activities, the exemption is not available. This advance ruling seems to be erroneous. There is no merit in adopting the entry under service tax or interpreting the entry under GST, particularly when they both are differently worded. Under service tax prior to 11th of July 2014, the entry was wide. Thereafter, after 11th of July 2014, the government in its own wisdom restricted the entry to only certain specified services. With the advent of GST, it has again gone back to its wide entry part. So there is no merit in saying that the benefit of the exemption is only available to direct services connected with the constitutional function and not the indirect services. Next entry that we discuss is in the context of charitable activity. We need to be careful here because unlike income tax where all the trusts under 12AA their income would be exempt, under GST it is a sort of a half-hearted exemption which is given to charitable institutions. First of all, the exemption is only for services. There is no particular exemption which says that a supply of goods by a charitable institution is exempt from tax. Under VAT laws, at least insofar as Gujarat is concerned, even under VAT law, there was an exemption for charitable institution. There is no such exemption under the GST law. It is only for services. Secondly, it is also not an exemption for all services. It is an exemption to services by way of charitable activities. And the phrase charitable activities is defined under the exemption notification, similar to how it was defined under the service tax law. It has 4 parts. The first 3 parts, according to me, are self-explanatory. The 4th part, which is slightly tricky, is in the context of preservation of environment. So a charitable service by way of charitable activity as preservation of environment is exempt from tax. Here, there was an advance ruling in Gujarat in the case of All India Disaster Management Institute, where question was whether disaster prevention, mitigation and management, these activities can be said to be related to preservation of environment and whether the entity requires registration or not. The advance ruling authority took a view that yes, the disaster prevention, mitigation and management are related to preservation of environment and therefore no need for registration. This advance ruling was reversed by the appellate authority recently. The appellate authority takes a view that preservation denotes protection from loss, injury, danger, etc. Mere training, conducting of training programs for disaster management is not included within the ambit of preservation of environment. Again, according to me, this appellate or ruling is erroneous, but we need to keep in mind that for all charitable institutions, this can be a challenge. So we cannot directly presume that our activity is charitable and will be treated to be exempt. The department is taking a narrow view of the exemption notification, and therefore generally what I would say is that in case of such charitable institutions where we don't need to take a risk, we have to on a conservative side file an application for advance ruling and then abide by whatever they say, because in charitable institutions at least this at least in most of the institutions litigation on such aspects cannot be afforded. So we need to keep in mind that this exemption for charitable institutions is very narrow, it is not wide, and it is also prone to disputes and litigation. And the last topic which I would deal with today is composite supply and mixed supply. While ordinarily the transaction of goods would be governed by the goods rate schedule and the transaction of services would be governed by the services rate schedule, the statute itself makes an exception by defining an enacting a provision, specific provision for composite supply and mixed supply. Composite supply is defined in section 2 subsection 30 to mean when two or more taxable supplies are naturally bundled in the ordinary course of business, one of which is a principal supply. Section 8 says that in case of a composite supply, it will be treated to be a supply of the principal supply. Mixed supply is when two or more supplies, taxable supplies, are supplied together and they do not qualify as a composite supply. According to me, mixed supply is actually not a big problem generally, because there is a specific mention in the definition itself that both the supplies have to be for a single price. So in case of a mixed supply where the supplies are not naturally bundled, and if they are given for a single price, then section 8 says that the highest rate of tax will be applicable. But when as a supplier we are charging a single price for two supplies, generally we will be doing adopting such a transaction consciously, and therefore there is less chance of we faltering in our rate selection. According to me, the bigger problem is of composite supply. In the definition of composite supply, there is no mention of the requirement of a single price. So even if two supplies are made for separate prices, but if they are naturally bundled in the ordinary course of business, they can be termed as composite supply, and the rate of tax applicable to the principal supply would apply. Gujarat High Court recently, in the case of Torrent Power Limited, applied this principle. Transmission and distribution of electricity are exempt from tax. Question was whether the other incidental activities like application fee, renting of meters, etc., they will be, whether they will be taxable or whether they get included in the exemption. Gujarat High Court says that all these activities are naturally bundled in the ordinary course of business, and therefore it will be treated as the principal supply, and therefore the rate of tax applicable to the principal supply, which is nil, which will be applicable to all the activities, and therefore all activities will be exempt from tax. But we should keep in mind that while in this case, this definition proved to be in favor of the SSE, it can also backfire. Second important aspect which I would want to deal with in the context of composite supply is in respect of works contracts. While ordinarily composite supply will be taxed as principal supply, Schedule 2 makes a specific exception for two things, for works contract and for restaurants. For works contract, it is specifically noted that composite supply by way of works contract will be treated to be a transaction in services. So we need to be extremely careful in a case where we are supplying goods as well as services. Goods may be, say, lower rate, services may be 18%, we may charge separately, we may even issue separate bills, but the department takes a view that no, they are composite supplies, they are works contract, and therefore service, and therefore you pay a higher rate of tax on the entire consideration. This is again an ongoing controversy in the context of solar power plants. Maharashtra itself has an advance ruling in the case of Fernie Solar Farms Private Limited, where there were two separate contracts for the solar photovoltaic module, which is the main commodity, and the service element. The SP module was taxable at 5%, service at 18%, but still the advanced ruling authority takes a view that both these agreements are inextricably linked. The risk remains with the supplier till the completion of the project. We need to look at the substance of the agreement. Merely because two separate agreements are entered into does not dilute the fact that they are indivisible or inextricably linked, and therefore we'll treat it as a works contract, which is a service transaction of service, and tax it at the rate of 18%. This advance ruling per se is debatable. we can very well say that if suppose two agreements are entered, separate agreements are entered into, then there is no question of both the agreements being clubbed and being treated as a works contract. But be that as it may, we need to be careful in such transactions, particularly where the goods rate is lower. Here in this case, the SP module was taxable at 5%. So according to me, we need to be careful while planning such a transaction. Even if we suppose, except for the time being, that this advance ruling is correct, still the agreements can be drafted in a way that we can get out of the advance ruling. We can, if possible, incorporate a specific clause saying that the title in the goods will pass immediately to the buyer. Thereafter, the buyer will give the goods as a bailee to the supplier, and thereafter the supplier will erect and install the goods on behalf of the buyer. According to me, if such specific terms are included, then the department cannot take a view that we'll go into the substance of the contract and we'll treat it as a works contract and we'll deny lower rate of tax for the goods part. But as I said, this is a double-edged sword. Composite supply definition in some cases can come to our aid. In some cases, it can also backfire and lead to higher tax burden on us. And we need to be very, very careful while we are adopting such transactions involving supply of goods and services, or different goods and different services. So thank you all for a very patient hearing, and these were just certain issues which I felt were worth discussing. Obviously, this classification is something which will, in fact, right now the position seems to be that everyone has classified according to what they feel is correct. The real problem will start when the department starts issuing notices and starts raising disputes of classification. And when we start receiving such notices, it is then that these principles will really come to our aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uchit bhai. Yes. Ratan Sawal sir.
Yes. As I specifically pointed out in the beginning of the lecture, anuchit ko uchit karna. So, in the constitutional interpretations, he has analyzed various aspects which needed a careful thought on the speech. Now, so far as this classifications are concerned, on account of, so see, this debate is needed at least 3 hours. Whenever I used to deliver the lectures, I request 3 hours at least lecture sessions from my side. But he analyzed it very systematically manner in 1.5 hours, but some points are missed, which I would like to highlight on those aspects. Now see, this classification part is concerned. Before we go deep into the classifications part, we have to see the constitutional mechanism, that is Article 265 in creating this taxation world. Article 265 says that no tax shall be levied except the authority of law. So this term levied is most important aspects in the taxation world. So levied here means that not only the charging mechanism, but also making this charge into quantifying and actual recovery of the tax. Charging mechanism plays most important role so far as the tax is concerned. Now you will find in section 9 of the GST Act, this charging mechanism, under which this rate notification is permissible. I mean, a rate notification is required to be made by the government on the recommendations of the councils. Over and above, there are 3 schedules are there. Schedule 1, Schedule 2 and Schedule 3, which are appended to the Act itself. Now, so far as these schedules are concerned, we have to minutely analyze these schedules before you come into directly to the rate tax notifications. If you read carefully all these schedules, then you will find that there are 2 classes of, they have defined, they have underlined in 2 classes, that is some class is towards the goods and some class is towards the services. Over and above, they have given certain exemptions to certain class of goods and certain classes of services. And certain class of goods, though actually they are in service in nature, they have been categorized under the service category, and similarly there are certain services categories are categorized in a composite fashion. So therefore we have to look both not only these rate schedules, but also we have to see these three classes of this the three class of schedules which is appended to the schedule entry. Now, so far as section 9 is concerned, the charging section mandates that the government should bring a notifications specifying the rate as per the recommendations of the council. So therefore, isolatedly, they cannot decide the rate. They have to take the recommendations issued by the council. On that basis only they have to frame. So a charge when framed under the charging section, section 9, specifying that you are bound to take the recommendations of the councils, then you have no other alternate rather than to accept this recommendations of the council and then adopt the rates. So therefore, to that extent, he has analyzed to very and left it to the court, but definitely all these cases will jump before the courts. But hello, Vinod.
Yes, sir. Really.
Can you hear me? Because
Yeah,
here
yeah,
some
we are hearing.
internet problems are there.
Okay.
Now, second part, which it has highlighted, that first you look into the HSN. Yes, correctly. We have to see the HSN first, because the rate notification, under the rate notifications, they have directed that whenever any difficulty arises, wherever any ambiguity is there, then you please look into the HSNs. Indirectly, they have directed to look into the HSN. That is, first you go to the customs tariff entry. Now, the rule of interpretations applied in the custom tariff entry will apply. Now, custom tariff entry in Schedule 1, they have adopted this HSN system. So therefore, HSN system we have to follow. Now, in the HSN system also, Uchit has very clearly analyzed all these aspects, how to look into the HSN entries and the rule of interpretation of HSN entries. No need to go into these aspects. But at the same time, whenever any particular class of goods you are unable to find in the HSN entries, then the recourse not only is required to be adopted the common parlance test, there are various tests are required to be adopted. Various tests are required to be adopted. First, we look into the general parlance test. Generally, how you know. For example, in Kerala, coconut is understood as a vegetable in day-to-day cooking activity. So though coconut may be used as an edible oil for some other purposes in some other states, but so far as the Kerala state is concerned, if you go, then they will see that this coconut is nothing but it is a vegetable. So general parlance test is required to be adopted. First you find out in the HSN. If you did not find any meaning in the HSN, then first course is required to be adopted is apply. It is in the general parlance test. Thereafter, if you did not find in the general parlance also, then next to go to the commercial parlance test. Now the commercial parlance test means in the trade parlance, in the common trade, how the business people understands this particular products. Then the second test is to be adapted, looking into the trade parlance, a commercial parlance test. Now thereafter still you did not find because of some technical aspects. then going to find the meaning given in various technical theories. Technical theories means the technical experts given the meaning, and technical books, they have given various meanings. Go to those aspects, then find the meaning, and still you did not find. Then in such circumstances, apply dominant nature test. The dominant nature test, the product, the dominance of the product you have to see. What are the products? The composition of the products, you have to see that part. So on that basis, you decide the dominant nature test. Still you did not find. Then the product which are used in day-to-day activity, that is a user test. So all these tests are required to be adapted. Not only this common parlance tests, common parlance test is one of them. Then all these tests are required to be adapted when there is no meaning is assigned in the HSN. Meaning is not assigned in the HSN. What does it mean? It means you know how these schedule, these notification entries are classified so far as the rate notifications are concerned. First is that first part, serial numbers, then sections, then subsections, then chapters, subchapters. In this manner it is categorized. So you first go into those rate notifications, look into the words or terms used in that rate notifications. If the term is perfect, easily digestible, understandable, then go for it. If terms are not understandable, then go to in the specific chapter, there are various notes are given. The meanings of each chapter is given. Find out those meanings and see whether this particular, any product is, which is under confusion, is falling in this particular chapter or not. If still you did not find any meaning, then go to the general notifications, which is at the beginning of the HSN. You will find, yeah, in the customs, first schedule to the customs tariff, you will find which he has explained, which it has very clearly explained about these rules, rule 1, rule 2, rule 3, and all these things. And elaborately those rules have been explained. So there also they have given some notes. You find out those meanings. Still, if you are unable to find those meanings in this independent chapter notes or in the general chapter notes, then all these tests, as I explained, the common parlance test, commercial parlance test, general parlance test, then dominant test, technical rules, users test, then again a dictionary meaning can be adapted. All these tests are required to be adapted. Now, so far as the service part is concerned, it is not leaned upon to the HSNs. In fact, so far as the service part is concerned, independently they have given a particular chapter. So far as the services, class of services are concerned, and in that class they have tried to explain the meaning by way of interpretations rules. So interpretations rules, you will find below the notifications they have given very clearly what are the terms means. For example, agriculture product, what does it mean? Agriculture produce means. Government, what do you mean by government? Technical services, what do you mean by technical, the term technical services? All these aspects are, they have tried to analyze, but still doubts are there on those subjects. If you analyze, there are various meanings are coming. Now, not only this rate notifications which you have to see, but at the same time, as I pointed out, you have to see the schedule entries. In the schedule entries, for example, why you have to look into the schedule entries? One of the beautiful example, actionable claims. Actionable claims are exempted. Now, first of all, you have to analyze, or first of all, you have to think whether actionable claim is a goods or whether it is an actionable claim is a services. Now, if it is a goods, then to what extent this apply to the goods and to what extent it applies to the services? Because actionable claims, other than some class of commodities like lottery, game of chance, all these are excluded. So you have to see all these aspects under Schedule 3. And Schedule 3, actionable claims are exempted from tax, except some 3 class of goods like lottery, game of chance, and all these things. Now these questions came up before Punjab High Court as well as before Honorable Bombay High Court in online fantasy gaming. I have given a very wide articles in this AIFTP journal in the month of February or March, I don't remember. So there you will find that they have elaborately and explained how to analyze these schedule entries. They have explained this aspect also while interpreting this Punjab High Court, and Bombay High Court has acknowledged the judgment of Punjab High Court so far as this classification part is concerned. So what I want to highlight is, first you have to see this, whether, as Uchit has rightly pointed out, that whether it is whether the proper product will fall in the parameter of this goods category or in the service category, or both goods and services category. If it is the goods category, apply HSN rule. Not finding HSN rule, all these tests. If it is a service category, then in the independent definition you will move. If still you did not find, then you take the shelter of various judicial pronouncements. On that basis you decide this service category. But the question arises now, when both goods and services both are composites, then you take the shelter of these schedules. As I pointed out, there are certain class of services which are treated as a composite supplies. Certain class of goods, they are excluded and put into the category of services in the schedule entries. You see those parts. An important question is coming to my mind, that this generally this custom authority value the goods in the case of an import and import mainly. They classify on the basis of HSN entries, which they know. But when the questions of this composite supplies or mixed supply arises, then how they are going to treat these products? Again, a dispute. There are several disputes are there. Which are principal supplies? Whether service is the principal supply. Suppose a CD is imported, which consisting of ACC cement I am talking about, ACC cement element. CD, which is nothing but it is worth of 1,000 rupees is imported, but it consisting of a valuable data of designs and drawings, which consisting of in some thousands of crores of rupees. In such circumstances, how it is to be understood? Similarly, there are various aspects where importing, where both combination of goods and services both are involved. In such circumstances, how these custom authorities are classifying this particular product under which chapter tariff entry, again, it will create a various litigations. Already litigations are created. So far as this aspect is concerned, they are putting in some different HSN number which are not agreeing by our GST authorities. All these will arise. Therefore, importer or a person who is paying tax, he should minutely look into all these aspects before classifying a particular product into one particular category, and before giving a name in the HSN classifications in the returns. Now, not only this aspect, we have to see other aspects like, say, nil rate, zero rate, partially exempted. These are the very important connotations, very important. It has its own context. It has its own meaning. Zero rate doesn't mean that it is no value at all. So zero has a most significant value. We have to understand these aspects also. So zero rate, then nil rate, then conditional exemption rates given subject to fulfillment of certain conditions, and whether that conditions are imposed as per section 9 directions or under the exemption notifications, we have to see all these parts before we classify a particular product or a class of services into one particular HSN. I think Vinodji, you have to take now some questions, because some questions have came that whether a tent house is built for election purposes. So whether this will be exempted from tax under the service category or not, all such sort of questions are coming. Now, Uchit,
Yes.
Vinodji, can you connect
Yes.
to Uchit?
Yes, Pushitji.
Yes. Yes.
Uchit, now you can take, please take some questions, and some questions I will take. Now,
Sure.
one of the questions came that a tent is built for the purpose of conducting election, number one. Nowadays, for example, all these COVID-19 tents are prepared. COVID-19 facilities are prepared. Now, the question of the participant is that whether this can be termed as a service provided by the government and whether it's exempted from tax. This is the questions came from some participant, and it's very important questions. Can you please explain these aspects?
Okay, so first of all, I would want to be clear. So the tent is constructed by the government, and the service, and it has outsourced its service to some supplier, and the supplier is providing this service to the government.
Correct.
Is that correct? Yeah. So essentially here we need to go step by step. Firstly, we need to determine whether this government is doing a function which is entrusted to it under the constitution. Apparently it is. All these this healthcare etc. will come under the constitutional function, and therefore any supply of service to the government for this purpose would qualify per se as related to that function. But here we need to keep in mind two things. Firstly, the exemption which I talked about is only applicable to pure services. And then thereafter, because there were representations made that there are certain contracts where some goods are used, and the exemption should not be denied to such contracts. And therefore, the government came out with another entry where if the goods value is less than 25%, then the exemption was granted to such services. So first we need to analyze whether the contract consists of what quantum of goods. If they are supplying goods also to the government along with services, then this exemption for services will not be applicable, because it will be neither pure service nor if it is a service but with goods element greater than 25%, then that benefit of that entry will also not be admissible. If the goods element is lesser, or if there are separate contracts awarded for supply of goods and supply of services. For suppose the tent material is provided by party A, while the erection of the tent that is done by party B, then if it is qualifying as a pure service, then it should qualify for exemption. But if this goods element comes in, then it would be a different story.
Yes, I have some reservations so far as this question is concerned, which is this term composite supply is already defined in our act. Okay, so it is naturally bundled. That is the important context we have to concept we have to see, that naturally bundled. If the principal supply is irrespective of its mathematical value, if the dominance is principal supplies rendering of services, then how you are going to answer to this question? Because the basic important motto is to providing services. Like as I pointed out, these COVID tents and COVID hutments and COVID for these COVID patients, they are building all these things, coronavirus to avoid.
No, there, what prima facie, what my answer could be is that is why the government has maybe defined this value for 25%. So what they would treat is that if your goods portion is going beyond 25%, then we will not treat it to be a dominant service element, and therefore probably the exemption will be denied. What the view which you seem to be canvassing is that if it is a composite supply where the service element is dominant, and therefore goods would also be the incidental part, and therefore come to be exempt. But according to me, if the goods value is exceeding that threshold, then probably it might become difficult to canvass that what is the dominant element is service and not goods. That is why probably they are putting this limit of 25%. Otherwise, if we are able to prove that the service element is dominant, then obviously by applying composite supply, we can claim the exemption. But because of this limit, I feel that that would not be admissible easily.
See, this so far as this composite supply is concerned, this is in a substantive provisions, whereas this partial exemption notifications are brought by giving certain conditions is a secondary, a subsidiary legislation. So that substantive legislation when says that when it is the service component is naturally bundled, then whether this will supersede, in my opinion, this the meaning assigned in the composite supply that the naturally bundled will prevail over this conditional rate notification so far as this example is concerned. So COVID as well as so far as the rent is concerned.
No, sir, I completely agree with you. What I am only trying to say is that this percentage which they have prescribed, probably they would say that it is only a sort of a guidance for determining whether what is the
still lot of it is there is a greater chance of various litigations, but we have to analyze into the nature of the
supply
product and services.
Yes. What I believe is that wherever there is composite supply, there is a chance of litigation because of involvement of more than one rate.
Correct. Vinodji, any other questions I did not came across? This is an important questions which came up. I felt that we should answer.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I just read. Shall I read?
मैं देखूं?
Yes, yes. Chat box में देखिए.
Chat box there are 11. Very nice. Lucid speakers. Thanks. ये फिर कहाँ है? Any RCM applicable on lawyers fees paid by religious trust? Lawyers fees paid by a religious trust. Okay. This we have to answer. In the case of a composite supply, we have answered.
No, there the RCM is applicable only in case of business entities, and therefore only for lawyers to business entities there the RCM applies. The religious trust would probably not be a business entity in that sense, and for the lawyer services to entities other than business entities, those transactions are exempt. So if we are able to prove that that religious trust is not a business entity, then the RCM will not apply.
I think it is clear to them, but to add this aspect, when a charge comes in the hands of the lawyer, whether this is exempted or not, we have to see first whether that charging in the hands of a lawyer. So vice versa applies so far as the reverse charge mechanism is concerned. So in that context also we have to see. Now another question is coming. If in the case of a composite supply where the goods and services, their supply of goods is principal supply, then should be considered a composite supply and we should charge. We have already answered this aspect. With regard to the chargeability, had one query. CGST and HGST is almost equal in all states. I don't know what he wants to say. Because
I think somebody else will read out for you. Umang? Yeah, I'll tell you something very important.
I'll read out.
Please, one I will read. How is the classification to be done when the notification receive rate of 4 digit, but HSN code of 6 digit is available for the product? I don't know. I mean, this is really...
No, they have provided, Uchit, they have provided some ceiling limits to categorize a particular goods or services into 4-digit category or 6-digit category. We have to follow those, principles that some certain limit is prescribed, madam. So on that basis, we have to see whether we have to quote 6-digit because sub-chapter or main chapter, we have to,
Yeah, sir.
on that basis, you have to see. Some,
Samir ji,
I
I
don't know because
understand
I
that.
don't practice on that part, I mean written
No,
part.
I understand that, but
6 crore or something is fixed.
Yes,
Uchit
yes.
will analyze this
So,
aspect.
let me add to this. There are certain forms under the GST where they require more than 4 digits. I think
Correct.
that appears to be the issue.
Sometimes some forms are required 6 digits or more.
Right.
So for example, in GSTR 9, the services require 6 digits or more when you are filing the annual return. However, that is not a requirement, so it is not done while in the accounts. So that issue was there everyone faced during 17-18.
Okay.
Right.
So try to see whether 6 digit is there in every aspect. If you can put 6 digit, and in absence only that 4 digit will come.
Okay, next.
Otherwise, the last residuary entry will be applicable 00 you can put in that same chapter. I mean,
Umang, go ahead. Next.
I think there is one with regards to cess, so I would not go there. Can it be? It's not relevant for this topic, right? So
no, it is relevant. Cess is also relevant, Umang. That in the classification,
Yeah.
the cess under the cess law also classifications will apply. The rate chapter will apply, and accordingly they have analyzed which rate will apply. For example, leasing of a vehicle, whether the vehicle's old vehicle, new vehicle, leasing will apply. So classification has a very important role so far as the cess is also concerned. We should not sidetrack, but it is a very important topic. It will take another 1 hour to deal with this cess topics.
Okay, the question was on chargeability, but yes, classification is important.
Classification is most important, and you have to see the language of that tariff entry in that cess chapter. I mean, schedule entry in that cess chapter.
Next question.
I think almost all are considered.
Very good. We are finishing.
PPT presentation, as already Uchit has yesterday told me that he is unable to, because it is a very wide topic. PPT presentation is difficult so far the classification is concerned. Somebody is requesting PPT, so no PPT was prepared. He has highlighted all these bullet points. On that basis, he has analyzed these aspects and nicely analyzed these aspects. So, including the constitutional aspects,
available on the YouTube, uploaded by us. So that can be
I
seen.
got the association, so not to worry.
I don't think so, Nikita Ben. Any other questions are there relevant to our topic?
Thank you for completing in time. Let's move on. An excellent deliberation by both of you.
Yeah.
Moderator.